Dante's Divine Comedy, the Inferno, Canto 5. Dante and Virgil now enter into hell proper, where the punishments begin. They first enter into the first circle of hell, the circle of the lustful. As they enter, they encounter Minos, who apparently stands at the entrance to the circles of hell, where the punishments are inflicted on the souls according to different categories. Now, this Minos is actually a legendary figure, or at most a very obscure historical figure. Those of you who know the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur will remember that he was the king of Crete who demanded from the Athenians a tribute every year of 7 boys and 7 girls to be fed to the Minotaur in the maze on the island of Crete. He, being such an obscure historical figure, almost legendary, one would think that this is one of the instances in Dante's great masterpiece which persuade us to think that it was not actually real, it was not authentic. How could you put a legendary figure in hell as believed and described by Christians? But it must be said that if Dante places such a historically obscure figure, a legendary figure in his great masterpiece, it is for a purpose and a reason. And the reason, very simply, according to the early commentators of the Commedia, is that Dante makes Minos represent the human conscience. Just as Minos here at the entrance of hell determines the level of hell each soul should go to in order to be punished, so the human conscience itself is what judges and condemns us. I'm sorry, I forgot one detail. Minos assigns a place in hell to each of the souls after each of the souls who are destined for that place confesses to him. And this is a very important detail. It shows us the function of the human conscience as one's own judge and one's own faculty within oneself, which judges and condemns at the same time. When a person has done what is morally wrong, it is the conscience which judges him and which condemns sin. Of course, on this side of human existence, it condemns him with a certain hope of conversion, of repentance, and of going back to the right track, so to speak. So in that sense, Minos is there in hell as an allegorical figure, so to speak, of the conscience. And it's important here to bear in mind this function of the conscience as depicted by the figure of Minos. It is not so much God who condemns or judges us. If God does that, he does that through our conscience. And it is ever so important not to stifle, so to speak, the promptings of our conscience once we realize we have done wrong. These feelings of guilt, of remorse must be listened to, must be acted upon. They must not be suppressed. One can suppress them of God. One can suppress them, of course. One can deny, and we all have met people who enter into denial over the wrong that they have done. But as we all know, one can deny all one wants, as long as one wants, as much as one wants, but eventually one's own conscience will catch up with oneself, if not in this life, in the next. And so Dante and Virgil enter into the circle of the lustful, where those who have fallen into the sin of lust are punished forever. And the punishment consists, as Dante himself describes it, in being tossed about perpetually on a whirlwind. Dante describes the souls as being like snowflakes being tossed about on a whirlwind. And they are being tossed about in such a way that they never seem to fall to the ground. And this is the kind of punishment that the lustful experience in the first circle of hell. Mind you, again, we must remember that this is an allegory. It is not, perhaps that's not how they are actually being punished, but it's Dante's own way of telling us what happens when people give into their lustful instincts. And the image of the whirlwind and of the snowflakes whirling around in that wind and never seeming to touch ground is in effect the punishment that all those who give into the lust, into the sin of lust, experience themselves. The whirlwind itself is an image of that aimless wandering about for fulfillment that the lustful think that they will find in indulging in sexual pleasure without any restraint or moderation at all, indulging in sexual pleasure against dictates of reason and conscience. And this is the punishment that they will experience in the first circle. The punishment consists simply in the fact that that fulfillment they are seeking will always be tantalizingly evasive. What they are looking for, they will never find. Just as those souls in the first circle of hell are being tossed to and fro like snowflakes in a whirlwind, never touching the ground, so the lustful will forever, until they repent, but as long as they go around in an endless circle of self-indulgence in sexual pleasure, whatever happiness, whatever fulfillment they are looking for in these sexual pleasures will always evade them, tantalizingly evade them. Dante then goes on to describe an encounter with a couple. Before that, I have to say also the examples of the souls that are being punished in this first circle of hell. He names many famous personalities of classical literature, and they were famous because not only because of their crimes of passion, so to speak, but they were famous because they were leaders of whole nations, cities, states. And the tragedy of it was that those nations and cities and states were so great, so prosperous, so supreme in their sovereign authority and their prestige. But all that collapsed when their leaders simply gave in to their lustful instincts and allowed their passions to get in the way of right judgment that was so necessary to ensure the correct and right governance of a nation and a city and a state. Next, Dante and Virgil encounter Francesca de Rimini and Paolo. And these are the two souls whom Dante converses with, has a conversation with in this first circle of hell. And the significance of this encounter and conversation is that here Dante is giving us a phenomenology of lust. again, it must be said that when Dante puts Francesca de Rimini here and Paolo, it does not mean that they are really there. What Dante is trying to tell us by describing such a supposed encounter with them and a conversation with them, Dante can be said to have constructed it. It's a literary construction whereby Dante wants to tell us something about the realities of human love, of sexual love, so to speak. He had already discoursed on it beautifully in his first work, the Vita Nuova, which consists of several books of sonnets with his own commentaries on them. And in it, he describes very beautifully his first experience of love, of passion, of the love which is passion, the love of romantic love, one could say. But now, after a distance of practically 20 years, his views on that subject has somehow matured. And in this encounter with Francesca and Paolo de Rimini, he tells us how his perspectives on human love, on sexual love, on love as romance has matured over the years since the composition of the Vita Nuova. And indeed, he gives us what I've just mentioned, a phenomenology of, well, lust is too strong a word, of love gone wrong, when one allows one's desires to get the better of oneself and to ignore the dictates of reason and conscience in order to indulge in one's passions. Now, first of all, something has to be said about these two characters, Francesca de Rimini and Paolo de Rimini. Now, Francesca, they were historical figures, they were real personalities, and it's good to have an idea of who they really were and what they really did in order to have a kind of a background to understanding the conversation between Dante and the two of them. Now, Francesca actually was the daughter of Guido Vecchio di Polenta, the Lord of Ravenna. And she was the aunt of Guido Novello di Polenta, who was Dante's friend and host during the latter years of his life. At a very young and tender age, her father decided to marry her off to Gianciotto Malatesta da Verrucchio, who was the son of the Lord of Rimini. Now, she was at a very tender age, probably only about 14 or 15. And in those days, the marriage was sometimes done by proxy, especially if the bride and groom came from different places. And somehow, for one reason or other, they would want to expedite the formal aspects of the marriage, especially the signing of the marriage contract and even the sacramental celebration of the marriage itself. In this case, Gianciotto sent his brother, Paolo, to Ravenna to be his proxy at the sacramental celebration of the event. Now, Gianciotto, also something has to be said about him. He actually was deformed physically. There was a certain physical handicap about his personality that Francesca was not aware of when she was engaged to him. And Paolo was the exact opposite of his brother. He was very well formed. He was apparently a very good-looking personality. And when he went to Ravenna to stand in for his brother as proxy to his marriage to Francesca, Francesca was so enchanted, and she was under the impression that it was Paolo she was marrying, until she finally came to Rimini. And she saw Gianciotto for the first time and realized that she had been played out. She had been deceived. Nevertheless, she entered into a liaison with Paolo, and it was this that was eventually their undoing, because one day Gianciotto found the two of them together and killed each one of them personally with his own hands. It's a very tragic story. And this is the background to our understanding of the conversation between Francesca and Dante himself. When we look at the conversation, we realize whatever Francesca says is heavily nuanced. In short, what can be said is that her words convey to us an understanding of the phenomenology of sexual love gone wrong. On the surface, when we listen to what she says and how she says things, on the surface, we see that sexual love, when it goes wrong, can be very deceiving. There is a veneer of suave gentility, of glamour, of romance, of halcyon days, so to speak. And we can catch some idea of this surface impressions when we listen to how Francesca addresses Dante initially. And she says here in Canto 5, she's the first one who greets Dante. Canto 5, line 88 to 90, line 88 to 99. She calls Dante, "O living being, gracious and divine." In the original Italian, is so lyrically beauty. "O anima grazioso e benigno, che visitando vai per l'ere perso, noi che teniamo il mondo di sanguigno." She addresses Dante with the greatest courtesy, calling him a living being, gracious and benign. And then she goes on to say, "If he who rules the universe were friend to us," God himself, of course, "then we should pray to him to give you peace, for you have pitied our atrocious state." And you get this impression Francesca is being very cynical here. If he who rules the universe, God, were friend to us, but then again, no one in hell is God's friend. And God is not a friend to anyone in hell. There is perpetual enmity between God and those in hell. Why would Francesca say, if God were our friend, when actually God is not our friend? But it just goes to show, beneath the surface of suave gentility, of romance, of glamour, of courtesy, there is that cynicism that springs forth when that love is finally seen for what it is, when all that glamour is removed, and one finds oneself frustrated, disappointed, unfulfilled. Francesca says, if God were our friend, we would ask him to give you peace. But what is not said here, but since he is not our friend, we can't ask him to give you peace. You see the what do you call the empty courtesy of the words here. Whatever pleases you to hear and speak will please us too to hear and speak with you. I'm reading from Mendelbaum's translation. Now, while the wind is silent in this place, and then she gives an account of her origins. Then you have 3 tercets, so to speak, 9 lines of verse, in which she talks about the phenomenon of love itself. And she speaks of love. And she says here, I'll read the original Italian, amor cal cor gentil rato s'apprende, prese costui della bella persona che mi fu tolta, el modo ancor m'offende. Amor che nulla amato, amar perdona, mi prese da costui piacer si forte, che come vedi ancor non m'abbandona. Amor conduce noi ad una morte, keine attende chi a vita ci spense. Queste parole da lor ci fu forte. Love that can quickly seize the gentle heart took hold of him because of the fair body taken from me, but how that was done still wounds me. Love that releases no beloved from loving took hold of me so strongly through his beauty that as you see it has not left me yet. Love led the two of us into one death. Caina waits for him who took her life. And here, Francesca talks about the very dynamic of that sexual love gone wrong. And she speaks of love as irresistible. And here she makes a fatal mistake. She talks about sexual love as irresistible, but in truth, it is not. And here one must recall what Dante himself had already said in the Vita Nova. It's very interesting how she uses, how here she speaks, Francesca speaks of love in the masculine. Indeed, in the Romance languages, the word amor, amore, amore, amor is always masculine in gender. And in the Vita Nova, Dante had already spoken and I had already described the personification of Amor as male, who had helped to rescue him from all the vicissitudes of his emotional love for Beatrice. In fact, when Dante describes Amor as male in the Vita Nuova, some commentators say that this is an allegory of reason prevailing over emotion. And indeed, this is Dante's own experience and perspective of love. This is the substance of Dante's mature perspective on his experience of love. At the beginning, it had been so emotional, almost to the point that it seems to have overridden the dictates of reason. But as in the Vita Nova, he tells us reason did prevail over emotion. And here he tells us exactly this is what happens when emotion prevails over reason. The example is Francesca and Paolo themselves. When one allows one's sexual love to go against reason, then of course it is irresistible. And she speaks of how love that can quickly seize a gentle heart took hold of him because of the fair body taken from me. She talks about it's irresistible, particularly when it takes hold of a gentle heart. She's talking about how when a heart is too softened by the attractions of physical beauty, of the feelings of romance, of the glamour of romance, and one finds it difficult to listen to the dictates of reason and conscience. And when there is such a disposition in oneself, one is bound to fall, one is bound to give in. And she goes on to say, here we begin to see also under the surface of all that glamour, that romance, that suave gentility, the pleasure, and the supposed fulfillment and contentment that one feels, deep beneath there lurks a certain languid cynicism, so to speak, a certain rancor, a certain frustration that manifests itself. She goes on to speak here, love led the two of us unto one death, hyena waits for him who took our life. Here we see the malice, the malevolence, the feeling of frustration that one has within oneself when the bubble is burst and one wakes up to the reality of how this whole thing has failed. And one seeks an outlet for one's frustration, and that outlet is malice. And this is what has happened to Francesca and Paolo. Here, the phenomenology of love, of sexual love gone wrong. On the surface, everything is contentment, fulfillment, suave gentility, glamour, romance. But beneath, once one wakes up to reality, one reacts with a certain languid cynicism, a certain rancor within oneself, a certain, one can say, ill will towards others. This is very characteristic, and some of us can have seen it for ourselves in people whom we have met, who unfortunately had the same experience as Francesca and Paolo di Rimini. And next, Dante is so filled with pity for Francesca and Paolo. Then he asked them, what was it that brought about their downfall? They could have kept everything within bounds, a sense of propriety, of decency, of Christian morality. They would have been brought up, they came from well-to-do families where they would have been well trained to discipline themselves, to hold their emotions in check, and so on. And Francesca tells him that the beginning of their downfall was actually one day when they read a book together. And that book happened to be the romance between Sir Lancelot and Guinevere, the wife of King Arthur. And those of us who know the Arthurian legends are very familiar with this incident. But the important point is, why did Dante insert this small detail into the whole encounter? And what is the significance of this so-called book? A very well-known Chinese scholar on Dante by the name of Swing, I don't know what his full name is, wrote a book which is practically a commentary on this. And he very cleverly, to his credit, says that in medieval literature, authors tend to insert references to previous incidents. And when, in this case, Francesca speaks of a book that led to their downfall, Dante's readers at that time would immediately come to think of another incident in the history of Christian literature where someone else also read a book, but instead of heading for a downfall, it was a moment of conversion. And that person was St. Augustine himself. We know that the beginning of his conversion, or we won't say the beginning of his conversion, his journey of conversion reached a milestone, how do you say, a catalyst. When finally in book 8 of the Confessions, he tells us, towards the end of book 8 of the Confessions, he tells us he was in the garden, he was told to pick up a book and read, and he picked up the book and he read. And it was the epistle of Paul to the Romans, chapter 13, verses 11 to 12, where St. Paul says, the night is far gone, the day is at hand, put away the works of the night and put on the armor of Jesus Christ. And this was a moment of conversion for St. Augustine, when really his attempts, his efforts at finally at turning away from sin was successful. The reading of that book of that passage from Paul's letter to the Romans was a catalyst that brought about, that effected a complete conversion from sin. But in this case, in the case of Francesca and Paolo de Rimini, it was the reading of a book that led to their conversion to sin. And this was a contrast. Augustine read a book. It brought about his conversion from sin. Francesca and Paolo read a book, and this brought about their conversion to sin. And it was a sin, it was a conversion that they lived out for the rest of eternity in the circle of the lustful.